Hey everybody, I'm CJ and found a kind of an interesting tweet from of all people, Jimmy Palmiotti. Now, I like Jimmy Palmiotti. Of all the comic book pros, especially the ones from the old days, he's the one that's probably held on to normalcy the most, or at least he's one of the old school pros that's held on to normalcy the most, and put up a very interesting tweet. He says, "Do not write a comic in hopes of it becoming a movie. Write a comic that will make a great comic book. Your audience will appreciate this." And pretty straightforward. But, I mean, it is true. How many times have you read, not to pick on Mags Visaggio, but basically any creator-owned thing that Mags Visaggio has ever done? Picked up a comic book by Mags Visaggio, and it's like, this is not a comic book. This is basically storyboards for Mags's Netflix pitch. You know, this is basically, it's a soft movie pitch is what it is. And it's always, it's so transparent, it's so obvious, and it's just so easy to see through. And the thing about it is, when you do that, I mean, number one, it just looks so desperate, okay? Because there's there are ways to make a lot of money if your comic book gets adapted into a Netflix show. Well, I don't know about a Netflix show, but there are ways to make some decent money if if your comic book gets adapted into a movie. People have done that. Mark Miller, I'm looking pretty much in your direction. But for the most part, there's really not as much money in it as you might think when it comes to your comic book becoming a movie. And so there's just that to think about. I mean, it's like, how desperate are you? You know? But the other thing is, you look at stuff like Watchmen, all right? Now, obviously, I'm aware that Watchmen has been adapted into a movie, and I'll even say it's a good movie. I like the Watchmen movie. But the movie based on Watchmen, it's really not Watchmen when you think about it. It is a live action, feature length, like cinematic distillation of the comic book. But everything that makes, well, not everything, but a lot of what makes Watchmen work as a comic book really can't be adapted into film. Now, you can approximate those things. You can kind of reference the visual language of Watchmen as a comic book. But in terms of adapting those successful elements of Watchmen into feature film, you really can't do it. And I think Alan Moore himself actually said it best when a movie takes you through the story at a rate of 24 frames per second, right? It can never be anything else. And as a result, it's a necessarily linear experience. There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, and that's all there is to it. Whereas the comic book that he wrote, love it or hate it, it was meant to be read and studied and analyzed. You can, as you're reading the story, you remember something, so you flip ahead or you flip backwards. And when you found whatever it is you're looking for, then you pick up right where you left off. It's meant to be a non-linear experience. It's meant to have, it's basically a story that can really only be told in a comic book. And so all these times that Alan Moore has shit-talked the idea of a Watchmen movie, he's not wrong. This is not a comic book that easily lends itself to an easy and pat sort of adaptation. It doesn't work that way. But nevertheless, the it's meant to play to all of the unique strengths that comic books as a form offer. And I realize that not every comic book can be or should be Watchmen, but the point I'm trying to make is he created a comic book that was meant to be a comic book. This is a story that can only be told in comics. And so as a result, there's a uniqueness and there's a freshness that I suspect Watchmen will always have. Whereas, and this is the point I'm trying to make, you compare that to the, shall we say, some of the other comics that are on the market. And again, I mean, I'm not trying to pick on Mags Visaggio. It's just, that seems like one of the best examples. It's like there's almost, it's almost like the creators aren't even really trying to deny that they're basically creating soft movie pitches or soft Netflix pitches, and they're basically adding dialogue balloons to storyboards. That's really what they're doing. And it's just like, it would just be wonderful if the comic book industry could just create fucking comics. I mean, there was a time back in the 2000s when everything was written for the trade. Now, everybody denied it at the time, but let's just cut the shit, all right? Everyone knew, like, you buy the new Daredevil comic book written by Brian Michael Bendis back in the 2000s. Well, you walk into this thing already knowing that, oh shit, in the case of Brian Michael Bendis, I mean, I don't know if he was writing for the trade or if he was writing for the omnibus, but what we know for sure is that he was not writing for the monthly. We all knew this. And like I say, prose denied it left, right, and center at the time, but history has kind of spoken on that. Whereas today, or I should say back in the 2010s, everything started to get written as not so much written for the trade, although you would still see a little bit of that, but more that it was written for Netflix, or it was written for feature film. I mean, there would be a lot of screenplay, like feature film screenplay structures that are being used for major storylines and things like that. Rules that they're not bad to follow, I don't think, but nevertheless, comics have never depended on basically the big screen live action story structure. Comic books have always been able to tell far more dynamic stories than that. They've never been as limited as feature film is. And so as a result, the types of stories that you can tell in comics are infinitely smaller and more intimate than you could ever do in feature film, or they're infinitely bigger and more epic than anything you could do in feature film, and etc. And it would be wonderful if comic book pros would have enough self-confidence to realize that they have a very unique medium in the entire history of the world, and trying to make it something that it's not, it does not serve comics, and I would even say it doesn't even really serve feature film. So anyway, but guys, listen to what Palmiotti is saying here, all right? Don't write a comic book in hopes of it becoming a movie. Just write a comic book that's going to be a great comic book and let the rest take care of itself. But anyway, I'm CJ, and that's that. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, make sure you're still subscribed, comment, like, and share this video because it really helps me out. Also, you can find me on Twitter at Cole Loves Comics.